Welcome, everyone, to this explainer. Whether you're a criminology major, studying forensic science, or just a true crime buff, you are in the right place. Today, we're diving into humanity's ultimate quest to solve the absolute most foundational puzzle of literally any crime scene. Who is here? I mean, long before we had fancy databases, lasers, or high-powered microscopes, societies were already wrestling with how to definitively prove a person's identity. This journey from ancient clay contracts all the way to the very core of our biological blueprint is just, well, it's nothing short of fascinating. And honestly, it is the bedrock of everything you'll do in the field of criminal justice. Let's get into it. So, here is our roadmap for today. We're going to breeze through 1. Ancient roots, 2. Early anatomy and permanence, 3. The paradigm shift, 4. Systematization, 5. Landmark cases, and finally 6. Evasion and evolution. All right, kicking things off with Section 1, Ancient Roots, Early Recognition of the Unique Mark. Now, you might be wondering when all this started. What's really incredible about the history of identification is that way before we actually had any sort of scientific, biological understanding of friction ridge skin, there was an intuitive, legal one. People just inherently knew human marks were unique. A brilliant illustration of this is this Japanese domestic law enacted way back in AG 702. It literally reads, "In case a husband cannot write, let him hire another man to write the document, and after the husband's name, sign with his own index finger." I mean, think about that. Centuries before modern policing even existed, courts already understood that your fingerprint was your most unbreakable signature. And, it wasn't just Japan. If we look as early as 300 BC, during the Qin and Tang dynasties, the Chinese were actively using inked handprints and fingerprints on official documents and business transactions. They were actually establishing identity in court litigations over disputed business dealings using these exact marks. It's like an ancient version of a notary seal. Moving right along to Section 2, Early Anatomy and Permanence. The science emerges. Let's fast forward a couple of millennia. We leave ancient Asian legal traditions behind and enter the realm of 17th century European biological discoveries. The microscope is invented, and suddenly intuition becomes hard science. Let me rapidly walk you through this crucial timeline, because spoiler alert, these names are absolutely guaranteed to show up on your exams. In 1684, Dr. Nehemiah Grew first describes friction ridges in detail. Then, by 1687, Marcello Malpighi, the guy you definitely need to remember as the grandfather of fingerprint, uses a newly invented microscope to study the function and structure of these ridges. In 1788, Johann Meyer becomes the very first person to definitively write that skin ridges are never duplicated in two persons. And finally, in 1823, Dr. Johannes Percugia, known as the father of dactyloscopy, classifies these patterns into 9 specific categories. But hold on, simply knowing prints are unique isn't quite enough for forensic science, right? We need to know they don't change over time. Herman Welker actually proved this by printing his own hand in 1856, and then he did it again in 1897. Over 40 years later, he showed absolutely no change. Meanwhile, Sir William Herschel forced a man named Rajidhar Kanai to stamp his hand on a contract in 1858, which marks the first official use of friction skin by a European. And by 1880, Henry Foltz was out there writing to Charles Darwin, publishing the very first paper on the value of friction ridge skin for individualizing criminals at crime scenes. The pieces of the puzzle were really starting to come together. Which brings us to Section 3, the paradigm shift. Anthropometry versus fingerprints. So, at the end of the 19th century, the emerging, somewhat simple science of fingerprints collided head-on with a highly complex, established measurement system that the entire world was already using. It was developed by Alphonse Berthelon, a French police officer who's widely considered the father of criminal identification. His system, anthropometry, was the absolute gold standard. Get this, from 1882 until 1914, police didn't even look at your fingers. Instead, they used 11 specific body measurements, like your head length, foot length, and even middle finger length to individualize you. But the anthropometry system eventually came crashing down. In 1903, a man named Will West was sent to prison in Kansas. The clerk took his Bertillon measurements and found they exactly matched another inmate already serving time, named William West. Their physical measurements were identical. They looked identical. I mean, no way, right? This single case shattered the world's trust in anthropometry because it proved that identical twins could entirely beat the measurement system. But, crucially, their fingerprints proved they were definitively two different people. Fingerprints had won the day. All right, on to Section 4, Systematization, Filing the Millions. Okay,
identifying one person is great, but when you pivot to law enforcement scale, you hit a massive roadblock. Thousands of fingerprint cards are completely useless if you can't classify, file, and rapidly retrieve them. So how did we organize all this data? Well, you need to clearly differentiate these three historical giants for your exams. First, Francis Galton conducted the first systemic study and named the specific print minutiae, which are actually still called Galton details today. Then, Juan Vacadich, down in Argentina, took Galton's work and created the first practical law enforcement fingerprint system in the world. But ultimately, it was Sir Edward Henry, working in India and later England, who developed the Henry classification system. This became the standard for English-speaking countries, and it's exactly why Sir Edward Henry holds the title Father of Fingerprint.
Section 5. Landmark Cases. The Science in Court. Now let's shift the tone a bit from academic categorization to high-stakes, true crime. Because this is the moment in history when human lives, freedom, and even the death penalty began hanging in the balance based entirely on this new forensic science. Let me ask you this, and I really want you to mentally guess before we move on. What do you think was the very first homicide solved globally by fingerprint evidence? Where did it happen, and when?
If you guessed the 1892 Rojas murder case in Buenos Aires, Argentina, you hit the nail on the head. Here's what happened. A mother, Francisca Rojas, had her throat cut and her 2 children were murdered. She blamed a rejected suitor. The police brutally beat the guy, but he just wouldn't confess. Enter Inspector Eduardo Alvarez. He arrives at the scene, notices a bloody thumbprint on a doorframe, literally cuts the piece of wood right out of the door, and compares it to the mother's prints. It was a perfect match. Confronted with her own bloody print, Francisca Rojas confessed to murdering her own children. Because of this brilliant, undeniable piece of police work, Argentina became the first country to rely solely on fingerprints.
Following Argentina, the legal floodgates just burst wide open. In 1902, Inspector Collins testified in the first English trial. By 1905, the UK saw the Deptford murder, which was their first murder trial using print evidence. Over in the US, 1910 gave us People v. Jennings, a massive landmark appellate case declaring fingerprint identification a valid science in court. And just a year later, in 1911, People v. Crispy resulted in the very first US conviction based on fingerprint evidence alone. The courts were finally fully convinced.
Now for Section 6, Evasion and Evolution, trying to beat the system.
A really common question criminology students ask is, hey, if fingerprints are so infallible, can't seasoned criminals just destroy their identifying marks? Well, they certainly tried. Let's look at 2 desperate, extreme methods of evasion. Infamous gangster John Dillinger actually tried to burn his fingerprints off with acid. Ouch, right? But Roscoe James Pitt went even further. He had a surgeon literally cut the skin off the first joints of his fingers and graft on skin taken from his own chest. I know, it's wild. But here's the absolutely critical takeaway. Both attempts were entirely futile. Dillinger's prints simply restored themselves to their original formation within a few days, and Pitt's grafts, they completely failed to hide his identity. You simply cannot escape your biology. And speaking of biology, we eventually zoomed in even further. In 1985, Professor Alec Jeffreys completely revolutionized forensics by discovering DNA fingerprinting. Interestingly, it didn't even start with a murder, it actually started with a UK immigration dispute. A Ghanaian boy was accused of carrying a forged passport, but Jeffreys used DNA samples from the mother and siblings to definitively prove their biological relationship. This single case kicked the door wide open for identity determination at a literal molecular level, a real game changer. Let's bring this closer to home. Section 7. Local context. Fingerprints in the Philippines. Now, it's vital we connect this global history back to our local application and look at the critical milestones that shaped the Philippine criminal justice system. Seriously, highlight these specific names in your notes because they are highly likely to appear in your board exams. In 1901, a Mr. Jones began teaching fingerprinting in the Philippine Constabulary. Generoso Reyes made history as the very first Filipino fingerprint technician. The courts recognized the science definitively in the landmark robbery case of People v. Medina, securing the first local conviction through print evidence. And we absolutely must recognize Isabella Bernales, the very first Filipina fingerprint technician. These folks are the pioneers of our local system. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this thought. From an illiterate husband pressing his inked finger onto a Japanese contract back in 702 AD, all the way to extracting the fundamental genetic code of our DNA today, humanity has learned one absolute truth. We literally cannot help but leave our unique mark on the world. As future professionals in forensics and law enforcement, you are inheriting this incredible scientific legacy. The methods have evolved, sure, but the mission remains exactly the same. So, looking ahead, what do you think will be the next great frontier in personal identification? Keep that in mind as you study. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember to keep asking the right questions.